oath will kill me. If I am called in the night and refuse to come, this oath will kill me. If I see anyone steal white man's property, I must help him. I must hide what he gives me and say nothing, or this oath will kill me.
The whole system in this country, the economic system, is such that jobs are scarce. Automation is limiting jobs. It's decreasing jobs. And as automation eliminates the job opportunities, legislation will not create job opportunities. All it will do is bring about friction and hostility between the two races.
You see, there will be no progressive revival if black folks are not deeply involved in it.
I will obey all orders of the Mau Mau, or this oath will kill me.
Peace, greetings, and salutations, friends, comrades, and enemies. I am your host of the Mau Mau Hour, Pascal Robert, and today we have a great show. It's a bit of a deviation from our normal format because we are trying to come in with a bit of a feminine touch today. Are we living in a post-feminist reality? How is the culture industry shaping the way we see women in the world, and black women particularly? Here is an excerpt from the book we'll be discussing today by our guest. Youth culture is valorized and associated with liberated individualization, whereby young people, personally empowered through educational and economic uplift, can succeed. This focus on individualization feeds a range of self-regulating practices, drawing attention away from social structure and group politics and toward an atomized understanding of individual expression. Furthermore, against this backdrop of the dominant understanding of post-feminism, how does post-feminism, including especially subaltern post-feminism, express itself within the context of black politics? As a part of racialized discourse, one must grapple with post-feminism's place in the post-civil rights era. All of this is discussed in our guest's latest book, Reimagining Black Women, a critique of post-feminist and post-racial melodrama in culture and politics. Our guest tonight is Dr. Nicole Alexander Floyd. Nicole G. Alexander Floyd is professor of political science at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, a lawyer and political scientist. Dr. Alexander Floyd has been actively engaged in a wide range of political and legal issues. Dr. Alexander Floyd has been featured speaker at fora and symposia at a number of colleges and universities, including Bryn Mawr College, CUNY Graduate Center, Northwestern University, Prairie View A&M, Princeton University, and Syracuse University, among others. A strong advocate for minorities in general and women of color in particular, she co-founded the Association for the Study of Black Women in Politics, an organization dedicated to promoting the development of Black women's and gender studies and supporting the professionalization of Black women political scientists. As a legal theorist and activist, she has produced scholarship and provided commentary on some of the cutting-edge legal cases of our time, including the important Hopwood case in Texas. Her involvement and leadership around Hopwood led to guest appearances and interviews on The Oprah Winfrey Show and National Public Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to a friend of the show who has been on this show before when we talked about the revolutionary nature of church and Christianity, Dr. Nicole and Alexander Floyd.
Hello. Hello, and thank you for that very gracious introduction there.
Very, very glad to have you here. Dr. Alexander Floyd is a longtime friend and fan of This is Revolution, and also a good friend of the Reeds, Adolph and Touré. So I don't know if I would call it in the Reed tradition, but she is an appreciator of the Reed tradition. So, Dr. Alexander Floyd, I really would love to get into your book and the subject, as I will. So let's start with some basic questions.
Okay.
Now, the title of your book is Reimagining Black Women. The first thing that asks, because, we are dialectical materialists and we try to de-emphasize racial essentialism on our show. So my question to you is, why is it particularly Black women we're interested in reimagining? Aren't all women suffering some certain kind of materialist oppression in this international capitalist economy? Or are there certain particular things about the lives of Black women or certain classes of Black women that require this nuanced analysis?
That's a great question. I focus in on my work on Black women as political subjects, in particular, and Black politics more generally. I would say that, as other scholars have argued, it's important to center Black women in terms of doing political examination. I support race and ethnic politics and the study of Black politics overall, but this is still something that continues to be an understudied area. So to get specifically to your question, there are ways in which Black women and Black people and other minoritized groups get figured in ways that are detrimental, that position them in ways that focus on them as individuals and not as citizen subjects who can make demands on the state. And so in this book, I really try to hone in on the ways in which Black women are really my focus, of course, is not to produce a essentialized notion of Black women. Elsewhere, I've actually been very critical of the idea of a quote unquote sister citizen or a Black woman, right, in terms of a particular political subject. But to think about Black women and their diversity, Black women in terms of how different public policies impact them, and certainly understanding the importance of racism and sexism and class to those experiences are ideal. But part of what I focus in on in my work is the ways in which the kind of binary constructions we have of Black women really distorts our understanding. So we need to reimagine them to the extent that we need to think outside of these binary ideas about Black women or Black people as being either victors or villains, either abject subjects or you know folks who are basically prototypes, super minorities, positioning themselves to basically be deserving of participating in society and being able to make demands on the public good.
Well, what's interesting about that is that the way we frame our analysis of this revolution is that we generally, and I'm sure you're familiar with this kind of analysis, you know what dialectical materialism is, or kind of nouveau Marxist analysis. Our position would be is that the harm from all of the realities that you talk about are a classed harm, even within the context of Black people, in that the people who suffer these harms disproportionately are poor and working class Black people. And oftentimes Black elite or upper middle class Black people use the illusions of the suffering of their poor and lesser brethren and sisters to negotiate positions in the power structure that basically gives them a role as a broker or positions them as a kind of tour guide of Black suffering.
Middle manager.
Exactly. while they're going to the vineyard, sipping julep or whatever else every summer, and they're living in their $500,000 to $1 million house, acting like oh, Black Lives Matter, when the chances of their sons or daughters getting shot by a cop are like something like 15 to 20 times lower than a poor Black person who might be a high school dropout. So within the context of your analysis of addressing the reimagining of Black women, and I can if you made the analysis about poor and working class Black women, I'd be right on your page. But I believe in the concept that there are certain Black women who are the class enemies of those poor and working class Black women, and there's no need to empathize with their position. What are your thoughts on that? Does that complicate your analysis at all, or do you think it's an unnecessary nuance?
I wouldn't call it an unnecessary nuance. I would say that part of what I do talk about is the fact that politics is turbulent, right? It's not something that um, is always so simple to discern. But what I'm getting at is exactly the problem that people have with using a kind of Moynihan-esque analysis, as some kind of text for understanding all of what impacts, um, Black people. And so um, the idea of liminality, and this book very well could have been called Liminal Subjects as opposed to, reimagining Black women.
I want to
But
ask you to define that a little bit down the line.
right. So, okay, well, I have to do it here a little bit in order to answer your question,
Okay.
because what I'm really getting at are the ways, in part connected to what you're saying, are the ways in which we see either Black people as being abject, and not thinking about the ways in which capitalism or structural inequality shapes people's life chances, but really thinking about how their individual choices, right? People are poor because they haven't learned how to uh, advance themselves in a society that is really open. And we do know that people, the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is a myth, part of a myth of meritocracy. But the kind of way in which we have focused in on um, uh, poor people in general, including Black people, as basically the source of their own poverty,
Hmm.
right? And the idea that when we see people as abject, we see them as unworthy, we see them as um, being responsible for their own life conditions, including their material conditions, especially their material conditions. And so that's really a big part of the idea that I'm critiquing in this book. And part of what goes along with that is the idea that if you were just like these other Black people, if you were just like um, you know Black people who get it, who are prototypes of what success looks like, who are the exact opposite of what stereotypes are like, who are as you the current president once said, they're clean. Like what he said about President Obama at one point. He's so clean, right? People who seem to fit a particular mode of engaging um, society, who conform to prototypical understandings of race, who position themselves as super minorities, right? Who position themselves to be seen as the exact object of the Black abject. Um, so that's part of what it is that I find problematic, actually. And so when we understand the way in which those unhelpful binary oppositions really operate. And there are people who do support them. And President Obama is one of the people in my book that, of course, I focus in on. Um, that becomes an issue. I don't think that we can look at um, we can think about the subject position of anyone and understand or think, okay, this person is a Black person, quote unquote, and then we know everything there is to know about them. That, yeah, absolutely not. Ideology is real, and there are people who are very much into reformist agendas that are not interested in um, undermining capitalism, who don't support strikes, who don't support um, health care for all, who absolutely do not support expansion of our social safety net. They just want to have take their place within an already existing position. So it is critical that we understand the impact of ideology. And one of the things that your remark reminded me of was especially the one of the legacies, not only of the Black Power movement of the mid 20th century, but in a particular way, the assumption that to be authentically Black means to be poor or working class, right? And other scholars like Juanima Lubiano have pointed out the problems of that, right? The way in which people want to kind of draw attention away from, um, the otherwise privileged positioning in terms of class. That's a very real. I absolutely agree with the idea that um, at times race is deployed as a way to flatten our understanding of serious class um, differences, and also um, to really avoid talking about any of the complexity that we can get into in terms of thinking about Black communities.
Well, the thing is, though, from our perspective at this revolution, the goal of focusing on the conditions of the poor and working class Black people is not because we define them as authentically Black. We don't believe in Black
Hmm.
authenticity on this show. We think that in and of itself is an essentialized
Hmm.
notion. The purpose of our focus on the poor and working class Black people is because they are disproportionately reduced to the reserve army of labor, because that's a necessary function of capitalism, is to disproportionately keep Black
Hmm.
people of that class. And since our job is to not only criticize or critique capitalism, but to nullify it and bring back a more equitable economic solution,
Hmm.
one of the reasons why Jason and I concentrate on the material condition of poor and working class Black people is not because we have a fetish obsession with Black folk as Black folk, because we realize that in order to neutralize the evils of capitalism, these people are used, particularly because of the
Hmm.
way they look, and it's
Hmm.
easier
Hmm.
to reduce them to surplus labor. That process must be neutralized with a class
Hmm.
politics, because as we know, there are many Black people who are more elite or pedigreed, professional managerial class, if you
Hmm.
will,
Hmm.
who wouldn't give a
Hmm.
damn,
Hmm.
because they believe that as long as capitalism lets them
Hmm.
succeed,
Hmm.
and everything will be fine. And what they don't realize is that what that means,
Hmm.
the ideal notion for a Black capitalist is that 14% of the ruling class will be Black,
Hmm.
14% of the middle class will be Black, and 14% of the poor will be Black. Sounds equitable, but this is the problem. The
Hmm.
ruling class, let's say the ruling class is always going to be the tiniest number of people. So let's say it's 10 people. So that means you have 1.4 person that is Black, that is in the ruling
Hmm.
class. Let's say the middle class is 1,000 people. So what does that mean? That you have 114 Black people of 1,000
Hmm.
that are middle
Hmm.
class. Now we know that the poor are always going to be much more. So let's say
Hmm.
the poor are 100,000 people. What that means is that you're still going to have what, 10,000, 14,000 Black people who are poor.
Hmm.
So in a capitalist paradigm, even if we have equity and it's Black, it's
Hmm.
and we destroy racism, all it does is still put the majority of Black people in poverty.
Hmm. Well, we're not just in disagreement fundamentally, right? In terms of this, you know, there are uh, there's a critical issue in terms of what is happening uh, materially, and what my book gets at are the ways in which narratives and themes and frameworks and even fantasies basically work to undermine social action and social justice directed at dealing with um, material questions. And so when you have someone like a Barack Obama, we understand his rise and his popularity in part because he is a way in which we can have a decoy, if you will, right? To borrow from Zila Eisenstein, she talked about sexual decoys. But he's a
I call him Wall Street's
mhm.
Manchurian candidate, actually.
But yeah, exactly. And so even in their post-presidential run, Michelle Obama and her becoming um, book, and their PR around it, part of what they both presented was the idea that she was successful. She was able to, get to the point where she is in life because she came from a two-parent family, right? This idealized notion of a family that more and more people fall short of actually attaining. We know what's happened to what people think about in terms of marriage in many respects. But, in their conversations, Barack Obama has talked about, well, this is, he came from a broken home, and this was the way that he talks about it really, again, underscores the gender component. Now, the piece that connects with the material question is that those kinds of arguments, as we know, have been rehashed, redeveloped, redeployed to actually take our attention. And this is what I talk about in the book, the way that it takes our attention off of those larger questions, right? And centers it into the issue of the self. And that's so basically, these ideas about post-feminism and post-racial politics, they're used to basically take our eyes off of those larger questions around structural change and place it on the idea of the self. If you have a problem, you don't need to be involved in political action and organizing about it. You need to buy something. You need to consume some products. You need to be in a heterosexual marital union. You need to be a good Democrat, vote and support everybody that you see in office. And I'm not against. I mean, obviously, to support a variety of people, progressive people, ideally, but part of what people can get hung up on, and this is connected to the ideas that I talk about in my book, are a very superficial form of liberal politics and representation, where we just want to see more people of color in office or more women in office, and we're not thinking about who are these people? What's the agenda that they're pushing? Whose interests are they serving? What are the exact public policies that they want to present? Where are they? So we can't make those kinds of easy assumptions. I start off one of my chapters talking about conversations about Bonnie Watson Coleman, right? When she was first running for Congress, people were saying, "Oh, it'll be the first time that we have a Black woman representing New Jersey." Well, we also had a conservative, who was Mia Love, going to be the first person representing Black women representing Utah. But what does that mean? You can't, have a very superficial understanding of what representation means descriptively, and not understand what substantive representation looks like. And so I think that what I'm arguing in the book is actually consonant with what you're describing.
Excellent. And I've seen that in the way you particularly integrate class in your analysis. A more kind of pedestrian question that I should have asked first, but I think it's very important. What motivated you to write this book?
What motivated me to write this book? Well, I was looking for a second book project, and I had a range of things that I wanted to talk about. And I was very upset by, and I talk about this in the intro, right? The way I thought some things were really undermining my work in the classroom. And more specifically, at the time, there was a hot new show out called Grey's Anatomy.
I saw that.
And I had so I had some students who wanted to use Grey's Anatomy. I had a project where they had to take ideas that we learned in class and apply them, to something in pop culture. I had a long list, but they didn't want anything on that long list. Said, "Look, I'll do it. I haven't seen the show. You give me some episodes, and then so I can actually grade your paper." And they were like, "Oh, you'll love it. It's multicultural. There are lots of women on it and all this kind of stuff." But when I saw it, I saw something very different than what my students saw, right? There was a very superficial idea of multiculturalism and representation, what others would call a do-me feminism, where feminism was read simply as having license to have sex whenever you want it, however you want it. And let me just say that I'm not certainly not being judgmental by people and their sexual choices. What I'm saying that how sexism was represented and ideas about gender liberation were represented had nothing to do with the real world politics and the serious issues that people can face in the workplace, in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of what people actually face when they try to break into those professions, like surgery. There are real situations with discrimination and outgroup activity that happens in those spaces. As we know, none of that happens, none of it on Grey's Anatomy, and it was a very superficial display of multiculturalism and a focus again on feelings in terms of what encompassed the whole scope of play. And what's interesting too is that all of the people, particularly in the early seasons, came from what people would call broken homes that would basically reconstitute family in the workplace. And so again, all of those. Somebody said yes. I don't know that got dang Moynihan. Yes, even the subtext right of that show really played out
You know,
within the context of that. And
I
so I
always
was
find
angry. I
I,
was mad. I was mad about that. And then I also watched Crash, and what else? What else rounded it out? And then the Obama campaign. There was another movie too that just I'm like, you know what? I always said, don't get mad, get published. And so I had in mind to write one article just to kind of get this out my system. And then a book happened.
that's an amazing story, quite honestly. Well, I want to get back to Moynihan. I've always realized, right, because people really don't. One of the problems we have in the here on This Is Revolution podcast, we call the 50-year plus counter revolution, which is basically everything after 1968. The theory is of the 50-year plus counter revolution is that all of American politics after 68 is a counter revolution against the achievements of the civil rights, this Cold War civil rights coalition. If you understand what I mean, right? And I don't think it's difficult for you as a political scientist and lawyer to understand at all the nature of that. You probably forgot more about that than I have. But the point I'm trying to convey to you is that when you read the actual statistics of Black life in Jim Crow, one of the most ridiculous canards of these, how should I pronounce this? Nig cells that we have on the internet, these men's rights, these kind of black men who are trying to blame everything on black women. Oh, they have baby, they got babies out of wedlock. All of this, like Moynihan, it's the welfare that destroyed the black family, and when the black family, and I always tell these morons, I said, in 1959, when we had a much lower rate of single black mothers in the black community that we had now, I think in 1959 it was actually less than 25%. The poverty, the percentage of black people in America that lived below the poverty line was over 55%. Today, when we have this epidemic of single parent mamas, the percentage of black people below the poverty line is less than 20%. So where is the materialist analysis? Oh, it's the sick baby mamas that's causing the poverty. What are you talking about? It was better, in my common soul voice, it was better before integration, because that dumb bastard is considered a hero to these morons. And they're like, how much do you think the Hoover Institute pays that moron to say these things, which are nonsensical?
And I would actually, well, to be sure, and I would actually encourage people to actually read the Moynihan report if they have not, because in it, Daniel Patrick Moynihan says very directly, now that, of course, he uses the word Negroes, right? Now that Black people have gotten legal equality, right? They're going to basically want substantive equality or economic equality. And so he specifically has in mind, right, the next step in his view in terms of what people would be pushing for. And so he actually literally presents an alternative to thinking about that. Well, but poverty, it's not about anything having to do with how the economy is actually structured. It has to do with the microstructure of the family. And so it's a direct attack. Right. He does it very directly.
Well, it's a consequence of the fact that he's a cultural pluralist, which is a very right-wing concept, which comes out of the University of Chicago School of Analyzing Americans based on their different cultures. Oh, the Italians, like Soul, the imbecile said, well, the Italians could do it and the Jews could do it. How come, well, the Italians didn't have 65% of their labor picking cotton until 1965.
And it's also about his own kind of Hell's Kitchen background, I think. But
he's a GI Bill beneficiary. The government is what made his life possible.
He went down believing that he was just prescient, although even at the end of his life, he thought that some of the criticism that people, had about the so-called Black underclass was off. But I would say that, part of what has uh, happened, and part of how we can understand how so many people were taken aback by uh, something like a Trump and the kind of support that he has, is because people drank the Kool-Aid of post-feminism and post-racial politics, that somehow we were that there weren't any kinds of issues that we needed to address in terms of racism, sexism, and definitely not in terms of questions of class, and that the sky was the limit, and look at all the diversity that we have. And so post-feminism and post-racial narratives are basically fantasies, right? But they circulate at the same time and compete for attention among a lot of different ways of understanding and seeing the world. But it has been really the kind of something that's proliferated and has dominated our understanding and our thinking about things. And so it's manifested at times as been there, done that kind of sentiment. That anything that's a problem is something that basically has occurred in the past. It's also, as you pointed out, uh, a kind of a revival, a new traditionalism, where people are pushing for a world that they've never ever had, right? Or thinking about these kind of patriarchal ideas about uh, achievement, about gaining access to marriage, or having additional out of the wounded masculinity, trying to have as many women in their lives as possible, or doing or saying things that denigrate women in general. So all of those things are really tied together. And so the Moynihan report, many people who try to understand the origins of things will point to the failure of the passage of the ERA or all kinds of other stuff. But really, it dates back to the Moynihan report. McSteamy and McDreamy are McMulticulty. Absolutely, Mark Owen. Absolutely.
Don't look at the chat. Don't do it.
Don't look at the chat. Sorry, it's just
good.
there. I'm used to doing that in the classroom when I'm on Zoom. So okay, I won't do it.
No, I'm being facetious. We have a great. These are our patrons. So look at the chat because they pay to be here. So I can't tell.
Okay.
Don't look at their comments.
Okay.
But okay, I mean, let's define some terms. Because you
Sure.
said something that's very important, which is a major theme in your book. Can you define post-feminism for our viewers?
Sure. Post-feminism again is the idea that, well, it's basically any fantasy narrative or idea that suggests that we don't need social change around questions of gender, right? Somebody said, ha 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 ha. Yeah, but people actually have bought into that. It also can manifest as a push for traditionalism. And so we have, and somebody could say, well, how could anybody think that we don't need, we haven't needed, there's no need for feminism, or that people don't have problems with sexism. Well, some people actually did buy into and do buy into that notion. They've been disabused of that. I mean, that's why for some people, the overturning of Roe is a shock, even though for decades there have been forces, very powerful and well-financed forces, working, as we know, to manipulate the court, develop the Federalist Society, and literally position people in Supreme Courts and throughout the country in terms of what's happening in our state legislatures to make this happen.
Well,
right?
we know what that's
That.
about. It's because America's
Well,
in population decline. That's all. These men don't care about the woman's body. It's about the fact that they want to keep their population is dying and decreasing all over the Western world, and they need people to have babies.
And in particular, there are more Black and brown people, right? Demographically.
Right. About the browning of America as well.
Yeah.
Fear of white genetic survival.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that. So in a nutshell, that's what post-feminism is. It's a tricky term because it's what's developed in the literature. It's like how are we post anything? How are we post-feminism? It's basically, if you think of it as a wish of being post-feminist, or a wish of being beyond racism, then this would be kind of more accurate, or wished, and really those questions, the narratives really, all of it deflects from an attention to dealing with
Well,
class
let
questions.
me respond to that. Let me tell you what the because I know you don't do the YouTube commentators who are talking about gender issues, particularly the black.
Hmm.
Because if you didn't know,
Hmm.
there's a massive intra-racial gender war on social media
Hmm.
between
Ah,
black men and black women. We may talk
yes.
about that. I don't want to depress you,
Uh-huh.
but but
I- I'm I'm not unaware. I mean, I don't spend hours watching it, in my spare time, but I'm familiar with the general outlines of this. And of course, this has just moved over into another medium, right? In my first book, I talked about the Hares, Nathan and Julia Hare, and Jawanza Kunjufu, and all of that crowd. This is basically another iteration of this for a new generation and in a new context.
right.
But what are the things that stand out in your mind about it?
Basically, there has been no explanation to particularly America about what has caused the fracture of Black life in America. And people don't
Hmm.
realize it's a very simple conundrum in that the period of time in which Black people finally got some level of rights, i.e., the 60s, is on the precipice of bringing forth neoliberalism. So Black people, everyone else is getting the 50s, they're getting the New Deal, they're getting everything. And what happens is that in the 60s, Black people start feeling deindustrialization because people don't realize there
Hmm.
was a second wave of a great migration that started in
Hmm.
the actually 50s and even going into the 60s. And the deindustrialization, lack of jobs in the inner cities is what leads to a lot of those urban rebellions at some point. And the consequence of those jobs disappearing is an increase in crime and an increase in incarceration. Mass incarceration even started before Nixon. And it was based on the fact that
Hmm.
a lack
Hmm.
of economic opportunity started to cause increased rates of incarceration for Black males because the state was not interested in investing other social solutions for their poverty because they needed an increased reserve army of labor to place the surplus labor because we were moving into the Milton Friedman-esque neoliberal era with the advent of
Hmm.
Nixon because we had the Nixon shock, we had 68, all these other phenomena, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
this is what actually starts causing the actual breakup of the Black family is because deindustrialization robs inner city Black men of decent union jobs because there's a period of time, particularly
Hmm.
in areas for like a 5 to 10 year period, a lot of Black men had good union jobs in cities like
Hmm.
Detroit in the Midwest, but deindustrialization would
Hmm.
take them out and
Hmm.
moving those
Hmm.
jobs to the suburbs in the
Hmm.
proximity to those cities, and as a result, lost wages means the
Hmm.
parents skip out, not get married, not pay child support, and it leads to an increase of single mothers, and that metastasizes and gets worse and worse after the 70s come in
Hmm.
with the
Hmm.
introduction of
Hmm.
heroin and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
this fracture of the Black family is like, oh, it's the welfare. It was the welfare. Because guess
Hmm.
what? It
Hmm.
started happening before the Great Society. All right.
But it's a very seductive idea, because when you have social norms that are based on what Moynihan called a patrifocal society, but also when you hit a kind of cultural context where people are operating and pushing ideas about wounded masculinity, right? That you're I think absolutely right in terms of the material transitions of the society from you know um, you know different types of factory production to service economies, and what's happening now even more in terms of the information age, and the way that it's advanced. At the same time, how that gets interpreted, somebody said that gender war is a proxy for class war. To a certain extent that's true. I like to think of it in terms of how um, ideology gets deployed in terms of understanding the root causes of things, and how those narratives function, not only in terms of formal politics, in terms of elections, but also how it happens in popular culture. Those different domains uh, co-constitute each other. They're connected. in a very intimate way.
Well, let me continue with my to advance my position.
Yeah, and the welfare argument implies that people are lazy and irresponsible children, right? And that's part of what when I talk about liminal subjects, it's and how that's a problem. It's because people again understand Black people as being betwixt and between kind of these polarities of either being abject, unworthy, um, immoral, or respectable, upstanding, prototypical super minorities, um, and that's that's also a kind of framing that takes our eyes off of where they should be analytically, and so that's why for me that's part of ground zero. That's part of ground zero.
Well, another phenomenon I think is important that continues is how do we get from the period of the 60s to today, where we have what
Hmm.
I believe is a crisis of masculinity. What happens is that
Hmm.
with the advent of second wave feminism, we see that as also as a result of the consequence of a lot of these industrial jobs being lost, women don't go to work because like, oh, I can get a job now. I don't need a man. They're going to work because the husband's income is not enough to pay the bills because the industrial jobs are leaving. So women are working now that their ability to have material resources causes tensions in not only Black households but white households. You start to see an increase in divorce, and as a result, because young men are not having contact with fathers, and they believe that somehow the which and there might be a correlation. I don't deny that the lack of presence of a father, because a young man gets 13, 14 years old, he might start to try to challenge his mom. So it doesn't have to be a dad. It could be a grandfather. It could be an uncle. But I do believe that young men need to have some masculine presence. And it doesn't have to be abusive, just to somehow kind of calm them down in their progressing years. But when deindustrialization makes that impossible, it starts to cause generations of men who kind of are alienated from senses of masculinity. And when we have increases of crime, let's not forget popular music, i.e. hip hop, that starts to create very perverted notions of masculinity
Hmm.
that make a metaphor for crime and authenticity. And going also in the disco era, we have the sexual revolution, and we have all of these pop cultural industry created manifestations that don't have people, studying Fanon like they were during Black Power. Not that we should
Hmm.
romanticize that era, and end up saying, I'm either going to dance or shoot up some heroin or listen to some hip hop or get paid. So there's no actual analysis or actually retrospective understanding of
Hmm.
what's causing the materiality to give
Hmm.
people the time to do that. And the reason that is that there's no really good jobs for working class people because they're slowly eviscerating. And this quote unquote crisis of masculinity, it isn't a crisis of masculinity. It's because these fools don't realize the ideal patriarchal man that we had in America, that only existed during the New Deal period. It was the government
Hmm.
that was
Hmm.
bankrolling that, Ozzie and Harriet crap. Why do you think all these Father Knows Best TV shows are in the 50s? Because they were living up to the wrong of the New Deal. Go study
Now,
American 19th century and early 20th history and talk about women are not working. Women
hmm
were working their asses off because it was a
well,
hard
I'm
life. So
yeah,
what these people don't understand.
I'm gonna do a shameless plug for my first book called Gender, Race, and Nationalism in Contemporary Black Politics, that talks about the Black male crisis and and specifically Black male crisis ideology in popular culture and also in public policy. I'm just going to put this right here.
I'm going to try to get
Yeah,
a
you
link
need
to
to read
that book.
that. Read that, and also Willie Leggett has a really great piece on Black male crisis ideology in an edited volume by Adolph Reed Jr. I think it came out in like '99. But I'm glad that you mentioned this question about Black male crisis ideology. I would say that one of the things that I would add is that of course Black women have always had a higher workforce participation rate than other women, and the narrative around women coming into the workforce is really in the mid 20th century is really about middle class white women. Um, I would also add that one of the differences, I'm critical in some cases of Black cultural nationalism, especially, but and other forms of nationalism. But at least the Black Panthers did have a critique of capitalism in some measure. That's dropped out of contemporary forms of nationalism. In one chapter of my book, I talk about Bill Cosby. And of course, we know his pound cake speech that he gave on the 50th anniversary of Brown, right?
Hmm.
People somehow saw that as, you know, just it's something that they couldn't understand. Otherwise he was a great guy. He had a great TV program, but really how could he, you know, allegedly rape over 50 plus women? But really, it all is two sides of the same coin, because in his representation on his famous Cosby show, he was essentially projecting himself on one part of that liminal subjects binary, right? Thinking about himself as some kind of super minority, and that whole family as an antidote, right, to who we think about as the Black poor. The second piece of that, the for Cosby, I argue what he does. He always presented himself as a kind of a kind of a male figure that a symbolic Black father is what I talk about.
America's
In
dad.
America's dad, and Obama, right, serves that function as a symbolic Black father. But the side of that, his wounded masculinity, and of course his um, alienation and disaffection from his father, who he saw as a problem, suffered from alcoholism, felt wasn't a part of his life. You know, part of his predatory behavior towards women really has to do with his trying to create himself as someone who is a powerful male figure in that way, to be able to dominate. And really, I talk about it in terms of a sadomasochistic paradigm, right? It's sadistic. You're trying to have and exert power over someone else. And I think it also explains why, aside from the fact that he was trying not to get caught, he did a comedy show called Spanish Fly,
Hmm.
which you can still buy the recording of. But as someone who was raping people who were unconscious, he got to feel total power and total domination in that context. So it's a really, I talk about it in terms of a perversion, or a way in which a very destructive idea of manhood is enacted. But they're really two sides of the same coin. The idea of him being some kind of model, symbolic Black symbolic father.
I'd like to play off of that, because let me I've said this on This Is Revolution podcast before. I hated the Cosby Show when I was growing up, and I'll tell you why. The Cosby Show was an innately reactionary show for anyone who was growing up in New York City in the 80s, because you had this upper middle class Black family living in New York City, in Brooklyn, in Shangri-La, as me, who was a young teenager, young adult in the 60s. That's the peak of racial tension in New York
That's right.
in my life. You had Eleanor
That's right.
Bumper, you had Yusef Hawkins, you had Bernard Getz,
Louima.
Abner Louima.
Abner Louima.
All in my teenage and young adult years. I used to be furious at the notion that this show went on for years. They don't even talk about racial incidents
That's right.
going on in New York
That's
City.
right.
And what's most important to me about the Cosby Show, I love the Cosby Show. This fool had this show on during the Reagan 80s. That's not accidental. It was a completely reactionary show. That's
Absolutely.
why, I mean, as bad as Good Times was, it was at least Good Times talked about problems in the Carter administration.
That's right. But that is what post politics does, right? It operates on an assumption that it's absolutely reactionary at its core. It operates on this pie in the sky idea that we don't have problems that need to be fixed. You're the issue, and if you could just work hard, if you can just play by the rules, if you can just have the right family, if you can go to the right schools, if you can do X, Y, and Z, because we all know we have an equal playing field now, then you can be like this Cosby Show representation. So it in some ways it's a quintessential post politics and post racial show. And people think, well, but it has Black people. But it's not just the idea. It's the idea that racism doesn't matter, inequality, class inequality doesn't matter. You can live the American dream. You just have to play. You just have to play by the book,
No, it's
and
totally in line with where the black elite,
that's a
the black
problem.
middle class in America was in the 80s. Do you remember the 1987 cover of Ebony magazine with the black man with a suit and a black woman in a business dress? It said, "The new black middle class. Are you in or are you
Hmm.
out?" This is literally during the crack epidemic. So
Hmm.
this is
Hmm.
the message we were getting from the black professional managerial class, who was basically living in Shangri-La off all this Reagan neoliberal pump and dump into the capitalist economy, and like we have a right. I remember the 80s. I was in college, and a lot of people I love the
Well,
80s.
a lot of us remember the 80s.
That's true. I'm not trying
we,
to date. I'm not trying to date
we
you.
su- we survived the 80s. I have no problems. I'm grateful to be here. I'm happy with my age. We survived the 80s. Yeah, yeah. It was a hot mess. The
So
80s inspired. The 80s and beyond inspired me to become a political scientist. I wanted to do something about the madness.
no, I
Yeah.
understand completely. And living in Jamaica, Queens, in a kind of middle class household and neighborhood, a lot of people love the 80s. I pledged in the 80s. It felt good to be like, oh, we're having a great time and whatnot. But without an analysis of the fact that it was grounding poor and working poor black
Hmm.
folk and white folk to powder in certain places. I
Hmm.
would also argue that Bill Clinton did double down on neoliberalism in a way that crushed everyone
Oh,
with
absolutely. Bill.
NAFTA, GATT, the crime bill. I mean, he was a vicious disaster.
Tricky Bill is a hazard to us all, and he has an ignominious history. He was part of the Democrat Leadership Council that
Right.
moved the Democrats further to the right. And it's more than an embarrassment that it was actually cruel and self-serving and
And
harmful to
intentionally racial, because
so many people.
as you
He
know,
he
because
had two black women at his side when he signed welfare reform.
yep,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
he also during the election when he not get nominated to the Democratic position, he had Ricky Ray Rector, almost lobotomized black man,
Hmm.
killed. But the thing is, though,
Yeah.
as you know, because I say you forgot more about black politics than probably I'll ever know, is that the reason he did the DLC, as you probably remember, because I might be reminding you, is that the Democratic National Convention, the DNC, I should say, they did a poll in '84, and they did a poll particularly of white folk, and they found that they had been losing the white poor and working class
Hmm.
to Reagan because they had the image of the Democratic Party is that they were being too lenient policy wise with black people. So they got paranoid because they were losing working class whites, the Reagan Democrats, what they would call them. And they were like, we
Hmm.
got to find one of the impetuses for the DLC and the pivot to the right is because they were literally afraid of losing working class whites. So they said, yo, listen, we can't survive without the working class whites, because the Democratic Party for many years was a party of working class whites. So listen, basically, like, yeah, we
So
got
you're not saying they had no choice, right?
no, exactly, because they had the New Deal in the 50s. What I'm saying is,
Hmm.
no, I'm not saying they had
Hmm.
no point. What I'm saying is they intentionally chose, instead of negotiating a middle way to deal with this, to ground poor and working class black people
Hmm.
to powder.
Absolutely. 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 There's no question about it. And and really it's and set the stage in so many ways for
Obama,
where we are right now.
yep.
Oh, absolutely.
No, we've had.
Absolutely.
That's why I say the 30 years of Democratic Party, 32 years of Democratic Party reign for black and minoritized communities have been disasters for them in this country. I'm,
Mhm.
I'm not getting into Biden yet, but in terms of Obama's 2 terms and Clinton's 2 terms, they were horrific, man, horrific.
Mhm.
That's why I really get contemptuous when I hear certain, liberal black women on Twitter. I don't want to name names. They're like, "Oh, black men are voting for Republicans at higher rates because black men got least from Democrats than anyone else in the black community, gender-wise, except poor white black women who got cut from welfare and also increased in mass incarceration as well." In terms of
Well, I think yeah, I'm sorry, let me cut you off. No, I was just going to say that I think it's important to underscore that the vast majority of Black men did not vote for Trump.
Exactly. Exactly.
And I think that it's a empirical question, right? To think through what the 12% in the last election means. I think part of it has to do with an attachment to machismo. Another part of it has to do with religion, and the kind of cultivation of in particular mega church associations, with Paula White and others.
Can I give you a little statistic?
So it's something that's complicated.
Can I give you a little stat? Black men have always had double-digit voter participation for the Republican Party for years. There was not. I mean, Trump got a little higher. It's not shocking.
But it's still, it's still, it's still something that people find concerning. But I think the bigger question is, what do we do in terms of thinking about, uh, having a kind of, a politics that doesn't focus on just every 4 years and what's happening with two parties. It is a time now more than ever to continue to hit the streets, to continue to work
Absolutely.
in very practical ways to organize.
Concentrate on
I,
union
I,
jobs, union struggles.
at Rutgers, right now, unionization is having an important moment in rebirth. At my university, we had the largest public sector strike in the history of this state, and it was a very difficult battle. But 1,900 families are better off today because of what it is that we did together. And it took over 10 years to build the capacity to do this. It wasn't anything that happened overnight. And if you find a perfect organization or situation, somebody said of a church, once you find a perfect church, don't join it, you'll mess it up. Well, that's the truth for any kind of formation. But that there is a capacity that we have that we can use to build together. And I will say that part of how I do think it's important. One of the reasons that it's important to continue to talk about racism and sexism is because when we have organizational formations, those things are part of the dynamics that come into play when we relate with one another, and when we organize and when we develop plans of action. And so I join you in not supporting essentialist understandings of race and gender. I don't think that we can develop any kind of meaningful politics in that way. At the same time, to understand how when and where those things, uh, those manifestations of power come into play remains important as well, particularly when we're doing our organizing.
Absolutely. And I think my position is that we don't need black politics. We need black working class and poor politics. There has to be a class politics that demands for those purged of racism, working multicultural racial coalitions of class poor and working class black
Yeah,
people to go into
you know
class
what
war with those goddamn class
you know,
traitors,
but
class enemies.
what do you do when you have working class organizations and you have people who don't believe that women should be leaders
No,
or
that's
don't
that's
respect women
problematic.
leaders?
That's particularly
Right.
problematic.
Those are examples of how you have to be able to see things, see a number of things at the same time, right? To
Absolutely.
not
Leadership should be
dismiss
based
the,
on qualification, not gender.
but I could tell you that is very real. And even as we try to do any organization I've been a part of, political organization, union work, anti-racist work, whatever, there's always those elements are at play. And so we have to be mindful. We have to be mindful of it. I'm trying to look at the chat and see what's going on there. Okay.
We'll
So
come.
so
Go ahead.
this is what um, my hope for this project was to be able to provide a different lens for us to understand what's happening on the current political scene, to really trace the ways in which neoliberal politics have developed in ways that have taken our eyes off of um, structural inequality and placed it on very individualist understandings of the self, and on the family, and to think about how those fantasies have played an important role, not only in terms of formal politics, but also in terms of what it is that we receive and ingest, in terms of culture, particularly in terms of television, in terms of movies, all of those kinds of things. So, and to bring it to a legal frame as well, right? So some of my chapters deal with, um, for example, sexual assault, and how that takes shape, how some people are not even seen as um, uh, victims because they're not positioned at, because we like to have these melodramatic ideas of having pure victors and pure villains. And the case that I look at with Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the uh, black woman that he raped, um, was um, was an immigrant, was a working class woman trying to make ends meet. They the basically the New York DA's office abandoned her, and really public opinion did too. Um, you know, at different points, the media was really positioning, and you have to look at the details, that I have in terms of the work. But essentially, I try to highlight the fact that there are some people's pain that we don't want to pay attention to. There are some kinds of things that we don't want to address and that we overlook and we don't see as being relevant in terms of our politics and in terms of our legal, our legal sensibilities. And so that's something that needs to be paid attention to. And it's part of what this moment is about, right? We look for the question is really not, is somebody a pure kind of victim? That's why when in Black Lives Matter, the cases, people often want to look to, folks, were they selling something? Were they selling marijuana? Did they have any, kinks in their um, armor, so to speak? But the real question is, what is happening here? What's causing this? And to also, as Cedric Johnson and others have pointed out, to look at not only the racial animus that it involves, and it certainly does involve that, and yet at the same time, the kind of shift, the neoliberal shift in terms of the support that we have for cities and state, and the ways in which uh, hyper policing and surveillance has become a source of revenue,
particularly in the
right?
neoliberal age.
Right. So we can't, that. So I think that part of what I wanted this work to do was to contribute to those other voices that are trying to underscore the ways in which neoliberalism has really infected and impacted how we see the world, the stories that we tell or don't tell, and how we take our focus, off of thinking about the self, rehabilitating the self, and that really kind of superficial understanding of life, and understanding things in terms of how they manifest on macro level levels of scale, how it's rooted in public policy, how it's rooted in economic relations that we have
Political
one with
economy.
another. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Dr. Floyd, we are at the end of our hour. We're over an hour, actually. That went
I
so
can't
fast.
believe it.
That's a sign it was a good show. Please tell us you'll be willing to come back and talk about some of your other subjects or other books.
Absolutely.
And the
Absolutely. It's
second
been
time,
it's been a pleasure to be here.
please check out Dr. Nicole Alexander Floyd's first appearance on This Is Revolution podcast. You can search on YouTube for what is the revolutionary potential of the Christian church. Was it Christian church or black church? I think it was Christian church. But or
I
Christianity.
can't
I think it was
remember.
Christianity. But
Mhm.
thank you so much for joining us. And we are